Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Beatrice Dupuy and I'm the Director of Circle. I am joined today by Kate Mackay, Associate Director, and Marisol Aguirre, Outreach Coordinator. We are at the top of the hour, so it's time to get started with a few announcements first. For those who are not already familiar with Circle, we're one of 16 language resource centers that until recently were funded under Title VI by the U.S. Department of Education. Our mission is to develop and provide quality instructional materials and professional learning opportunities to language educators. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities here at the University of Arizona. For more information about Circle's history and impact and what LRCs as a whole do and the resources they offer, you can visit the links on this slide. On this map, you can see where each center is located in the US. We are now preparing for our upcoming Intercultural Competence Conference. We have several post-conference workshops in different modalities that you can register for. Please visit the link at the bottom of the slide for more information. Today's webinar is the second of a three-part series that is focused on integrating AI in language education. The last webinar in this series will be in February. Please scan the QR code or visit the link at the bottom of the slide to find out more and register. The recording of the first webinar in this series is now available for viewing. Please scan the QR code or visit the link at the bottom of the slide to access it. Recordings of our 2024-2025 webinar series and previous webinar series are available. To access them, please go to our YouTube channel. As many of you know, Circle has been funded by the U.S. Department of Education under Title VI for the last 20 years. Now those funds are gone. If you would like Circle to continue to produce in the years to come the same kind of resources and programming we have offered for over 2 decades, please consider making a small donation that will directly support language teaching and learning. To donate, please scan the QR code or visit the URL at the bottom of this slide. It is now time for me to introduce our presenter. Dr. Kristen Michelson is Associate Professor of French and Applied Linguistics in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures at Texas Tech University, where she also directs the first and second year language program in French. Her research is anchored in intersections between human action and experience and cultural text, with a focus on pedagogical and technological innovations in foreign language teaching and learning that call explicit attention to culture, affect, identities, and ideological discourses. She's currently co-project leader with Dr. Bruna Sommer-Farias at Michigan State University on a Circle-funded project to create videos showcasing Multiliteracies core practices in world language classrooms. These videos will be available in summer 2026, so please stay tuned. Finally, she has recently begun exploring the implications of Gen AI for various forms of literacy development among graduate students in applied linguistics and foreign language learners. Dr. Michelson has led numerous virtual and in-person pedagogy workshops for foreign language teachers around the globe. In her workshops, participants can expect to be challenged to reflect on biases and beliefs and to learn through collaborative, discovery-oriented activities. The title of the webinar is Promises and Perils of Generative AI for Second Language Literacy Development, the Case of Reading. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, and thank you, Kate and Marisol and Circle for your invitation to this webinar and also for your support and continued running of these webinars, which are so timely. As Beatrice mentioned, I'll be presenting the promises and perils of generative AI for second language literacy development, and we're going to focus on the interpretive mode of reading. But before I say any more, I'd love to know who's in the room. I've enjoyed watching everybody's introductions come through the chat, but I'd like to ask you all to please take this very quick survey about your approach to AI And we'll take a look here in just a minute to see who's here. Okay, so are students in your institution allowed to use AI? So looks like a lot of it depends. Some yes, maybe some not sure. Okay. How about instructors? Question number 2. Okay, so maybe looks like generally yes, maybe with a few I don't knows. Um, how about question number 3? This is a self-reflection question. Which phrase best describes your position on generative AI in foreign language teaching and learning? Okay, it looks like responses are still coming in, but it looks like more adopters than not, with most adopters in the cautious mode. And that makes sense. You probably wouldn't be here if, or it's less likely, let's say, that you would be here if you weren't at least curious. Great. So let's go back then and let me tell you a little bit about myself. You had a brief overview, but I want to sort of position myself as an applied linguist and look at just give you an overview of some of the research I've engaged in and some of the courses I've taught, and mostly highlight the fact that although I've worked on different projects, the core of my work always comes back to this larger project of getting foreign language learners, especially in beginning college level language courses, to engage in more textual thinking or deep engagement with cultural texts. And the text types that I'm mostly interested in and working with learners are what I call everyday web texts. So I'm approaching this topic today not as an AI specialist, but really as a literacy researcher and a pedagogue, having dabbled with AI tools over the last couple of years and trying to think about how AI interfaces with this project of literacy-oriented language teaching, and especially when it comes to interpreting web texts and cultural texts. So what motivates me to do this work and what's behind this webinar today is a concern I've had about uncritical uses of AI. And I think many of us maybe share that concern in different ways. So I recognize its utility, and I'm also a user of AI, but have some concerns about how it might constrain certain literacies and how it might perpetuate antiquated teaching methods when it comes to foreign language teaching. So with that in mind, in this webinar, we're going to talk about both the promises and the perils from the perspective of the learner, and then reading pedagogies from the perspective of the teacher, with teacher used broadly to cover anyone serving in an instructional capacity. Okay, so this webinar will be laid out in 3 parts. First, we'll do some reading and we'll look at generative AI very basically. But just take a second to think about this question. Why do we read? And you can post something in the Zoom chat, or you can answer this for yourself at home. Okay, so we've got read to get information, to know we are not alone, for pleasure, information and entertainment, to understand content, information gathering, to have fun, sharpen our thinking, connect with other minds, interact with the world around us, to learn, connect with others in community. Yeah, so many, many different reasons why we read. And a lot of what you're suggesting reflects what I had thought about in advance as well. And when we think about these reading purposes, a lot of these connect with other humans, which you've also brought up, and drive human action. So reading a restaurant review online, maybe to decide where to dine out, reading an abstract for a webinar to decide if it's going to be worth your time or not, and so forth. So that brings us to reading in a second or a foreign language. What about this? I would say all of the above, and we might also add to learn language forms, to learn about other cultures, which of course are also reading purposes that are relevant in our L1 as well. But one thing is sure, and that is that reading is not a natural part of human development, it's a learned skill. So what skills do we need for reading? You can consider this question silently for now. No need to put this in the chat. We'll come back to that shortly. So ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, has indicated that the following elements of literacy lead to higher levels of understanding in the interpretive mode: text complexity or length, familiarity with topic and background knowledge, the ability to use literacy strategies, and they list here those literacy strategies as recognizing keywords, detecting the main idea, identifying supporting details, noting organizational features, guessing meaning from context, identifying logical inferences, identifying the author's perspective, and cultural perspectives and norms. So we might all recognize these as familiar skills and strategies that we look for and or train explicitly among learners. In his 2000 book, Literacy and Language Teaching, Richard Kern outlined 3 dimensions of literacy involved in reading and writing in a foreign language: linguistic, cognitive, and sociocultural. So we could map ACTFL's literacy strategies onto these dimensions of literacy, and it might look like this. So heavily skewed toward the cognitive dimensions of literacy. But what else is going on in reading that we might also want to capture under these dimensions of literacy? Certainly drawing on background knowledge and assimilating new propositions as we read. Within sociocultural dimensions of literacy, we're recognizing that texts are not neutral. They are created within and out of various social contexts. So within this dimension, it's also understood that text authors are creating texts based out of their interest, which is socially and ideologically motivated and tied to their identities and ways of being in the world. Authors choose various representational forms to align with the messages that they want to create and or the identities that they want to put forth. So reading also then entails recognizing bias and ideologies in texts. So although it's understood within these dimensions of literacy that texts are multimodal, I also like to propose a separate multimodal dimension of literacy, which might start very basically with recognizing salient modes and designs, including many of the same cognitive and sociocultural dimensions of literacy that we've just looked at. So let's nuance this a bit more, drawing on Kern as well as the New London Group, Crench, G, Burns, Ahrens, Swaffer, Paisani, Allen, Dupree, Kumagai. I'm also working from the assumption that reading is a multiliteracies practice. And for me, what this means is that reading involves all the skills and strategies we've just seen, but it adds the nuance of particular views of texts and roles for readers. From this orientation, texts are multimodal. They're ensembles of carefully curated and assembled semiotic choices that are tied to the situated identities of their creators, that operate in specific sociocultural contexts and reflect and constitute culture. In the interpretation of a text, readers do more than decode written language. They engage in multiple modes. They choose varied and flexible reading paths, and they consider not only what is being expressed, but how it is being expressed. So reading as a multiliteracies practice stems from a social semiotic view of communication. So with that in mind, let's read. Okay, here's a text. Go ahead and skim this text, and you can scan the QR code, and this will take you to the Menti one more time, where you can answer 3 questions. Who is I? Where is this person? And what is it? So go ahead and scan the QR code if you'd like to participate and see if you can answer these 3 questions. Okay, so we have who is I? Well, a learner, maybe, the author, the narrator, a tourist, a young adult explorer. Okay, so we have some more specific categories here of characteristics of this person. Okay, a tourist or visitor to Venice. Okay, so there must have been a cue in there that told you Venice. Okay, tourist, a writer. Good. Let's take the next slide. Let's see Oh, we have a woman. Okay, good. So where is this person? Some of you already answered it with the first question. So let's take a minute. Okay. All right, so we have some specific place locations. We have Canada. We've got the Grand Canal of Venice, a very nice place. So an evaluative interpretation. Okay, on vacation, a museum, Arizona. Okay. All right, let's take the next question. And if you don't have an opportunity to respond, that's okay. There will be other opportunities throughout the presentation to participate. So what is it? All right, we've got a phone, camera, a phone, a selfie stick, a phone. Okay. Object, an unexpected and unwanted event. Yes, so something in the text is telling you that something was unexpected. Okay. A phone, a tripod. Great. Okay, so you're all inferring what is happening in this text. You've all made certain inferences based on the clues in this text. In answering the question, who is this person, you're drawing on background knowledge and world experience likely. The text as it stands here doesn't give you too many clues to this. Now, maybe if you have familiarity with the Grand Canal, you might know that this is Venice. However, it looks like looks like the Grand Canal is not particular to Venice, right? So other experiences of Grand Canals cue other places. And in order to answer the question, what is referred to with it, you're also likely doing a combination of drawing on background knowledge as well as connecting details across the text. So we know that it is something that connects to a phone from the phrase, my phone dropped on the floor and it was not supposed to. So this it is some kind of technology that holds up a phone. Now, if I give you the rest of the text, this might help your understanding. And I noticed some of you already gendered the traveler. I wonder if all of you gendered the traveler and if this image matches with your imagined traveler as you were reading the text. So we're all kind of making inferences based on what is in the text or what is not in the text, again, based out of our experiences in the world. So now, having reduced this text to only linguistic mode, left you with fewer semiotic designs from which to construct meaning, but now you have a little bit more. And you might infer that this is a selfie stick. Of course, the title gives it away, which I hadn't given to you immediately, but now you have all of the cues that you might need to understand. So there's an interpretation working across the different modes of this text. So tapping sociocultural dimensions, think about this question for yourself. Who do you think wrote this text and for what purpose? Was it written by the person in the photo? Was their purpose to share a story with friends? Were they writing out of a particular institutional context or just out of their own personal interest? Were they trying to sell something? What is it that makes you conclude any of your thoughts? Okay, so we'll come back to this in a little bit, but for now, let's look at another text. I'm going to use this text now to illustrate lexical inferencing, so the kind of inferencing involving determining unknown words from context. So what I'm going to do is talk through a part of a pedagogical sequence that could be used with second language learners of English. Okay, so the text we're about to read is called Misadventures in Paradise. What do you notice about the title? Okay, we've got paradise. We might associate paradise with something positive. We also have adventures, which some of us might associate with positive, some negative, but we have miss, this lack or this negative prefix. So we've got a title that conveys a contrast between paradise, something positive, and something potentially negative. So we've got this contrast here. Okay, so here's the beginning of this text. And for now, go ahead and skim this. And while you're skimming the text, Take note of any words you do not know. Now, again, I'm kind of channeling an imagined classroom here where learners might be second language learners of English. Um, so go ahead and take note of any words you do not know. Okay, how many of you noted the words plummet, hoarding, octuplets, arduous? Let's talk through some strategies then for determining the meanings of these words. Plummet, let's look at this first. We could identify the part of speech. We might say this is a verb, and we know this because it's followed by to. So now let's look for the subject of this verb, the economy. So from our world experience, we know that the economy mostly can either go up or down. So what is it going to be? Well, we have another cue here. We have the term however, which signals a contrast with what has come before. So what comes after then must be negative. So we can infer that the economy is going down. Okay, then skipping down to octuplets, we might rely on morphological knowledge. The oct, we might associate that with other words that we know related to octagon, etc., meaning eight. We might also link this with quadruplets, triplets, indicating multiple children. Okay, and then we have arduous in the last paragraph. We've got part of speech. We have this as an adjective. So the entire context of this article so far is we've got this message system that is set up as a contrast between paradise but negative adventures or misadventures in paradise. So we can infer here that arduous is probably negatively skewed. So here are a few techniques to guide learners in lexical inferencing, and in some cases using discourse context, in other cases using morphological knowledge, etc. Now, up to this point, we're helping learners get the general sense of these unknown words, and they might not appreciate the nuances of these words, but that's okay for the first phase of reading, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later. Among many important ideas about reading, I really appreciate this message by Janet Swaffer, who said that students need to practice decoding message systems rather than individual words. So, although here we have been focusing on individual words, this slowed down process of walking through lexical inferencing strategies might have already helped you form an idea about one of the overarching message systems in the text, which we've been talking about. This contrast between what should have been paradise and hoarding savings versus what actually was a misadventure, an extravagant trip, etc. So having laid this out, students could continue to read this and further analyze the way this message system works in this text. Okay, so let's read one final text, and you can go ahead and answer at home. What do you notice first? What do you notice second? What kind of text is this? How do you know? What is the name of the organization behind this website? What kind of institution is World Nomads? So if you said travel insurance, that's correct. And how did you know that? Well, you might have noticed keywords like claims, safety in the header, travel wiser in the header, responsible travel. You might have also noticed the two buttons highlighted in orange, get a quote, get a price, which is redundant here. And you might associate this as a precursor to purchasing something. So all of these elements contribute to the overall message of this text. We have the claims department being perhaps the most salient linguistic cue, and orange being a salient visual mode, which is used presumably intentionally to draw the viewer in and engage in the first stage of consumption and inquiry. So in what ways are messages repeated across the different semiotic modes? We have, in other words, between the linguistic mode, for example, and the visual mode. You might notice this phrase, the best of the worst, which is a contrast. And you might also notice that this contrast is repeated in the image of the traveler in the picture, who is, on the one hand, smiling, but also holding their forehead, a gesture that's often associated with this, oh no. So you have a contrast picked up in both the linguistic mode and the visual mode. Now, we might further analyze this choice of the individual that the World Nomads has chosen to feature on their homepage, which appears to be a young white woman. So we might ask, what does that say about who World Nomads thinks engages in travel, or who World Nomads thinks has travel mishaps? So who is it that they're trying to engage with this particular design choice? Finally, we might also wonder why they've chosen to say true stories, not just stories, but true stories. This begs the question, what other platforms or with what other competitor insurance companies are stories otherwise assumed to be untrue? So we've just read three texts related to travel, and in doing so, we've engaged in linguistic, multimodal, cognitive, and sociocultural dimensions of literacy, recognizing keywords, designs, salient modes, and designs, guessing meaning from context, identifying logical inferences, identifying message systems, recognizing context of production, or at least speculating about context of production, and underlying authorial purposes. So in their ensemble, these three texts, all of which were likely written by humans, given their dates of authorship, all contribute to an overarching message system or travel discourse, a travel system, discourse system that we might call travel fiascos. So tapping our sociocultural dimensions of literacy in thinking about both the selfie stick fiasco text and the misadventures in paradise text. These seem to have been written as general interest recounts, both with some irony and humor. World Nomads, on the other hand, hints at this discourse system of travel fiascos, but we'll see later how it operates very differently when we step outside the text a little bit later in this webinar. So with that, let's stop for a minute and see if there are any questions about what we've talked about so far. And you can put your questions in the special designated Q&A area.
So how important are functions of decoding and language comprehension in reading comprehension? And what is your recommendation for that?
Yeah, so I think if I'm understanding the question right, I think what this is getting at is how important is language knowledge? And language knowledge is important because we need to recognize linguistic forms. We need to recognize and understand to be able to process grammar in reading. So it is very important, and this is why I like Kern's dimensions of literacy because he draws attention to linguistic dimensions, and that would, I think, be part of that, and then brings in, of course, cognitive and sociocultural dimensions as well. I'm seeing another question here, which is how does this apply to the use of Gen AI? And we're going to get to that just now, we're going to get to that just now. But essentially, what I'm trying to do is lay out some pedagogical principles by walking us all through an experience of reading with a lens of multiliteracies so that when we talk about how AI tools might help us in this effort or might compromise this, we all kind of come to this question with the same point of departure.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kristen. Those are the only two questions that we have at the moment. So if it's okay, we'll move on and we'll ask
Okay,
more questions later on. Thank you.
great. Yeah. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, we'll have another opportunity in a little bit for more questions and answers. So, okay, generative AI now, this is the part that you've all likely come for. Can generative AI tools help us with second language reading? And if so, how? So let's talk very, very briefly about how it works. Now, many of us know this already, but just to establish kind of a common, very basic framework, We can think of generative AI working with LLMs or large language models that are built on natural language processing and function as what we might call statistical prediction machines. So we're going to take an example from natural language, and here is one more opportunity for you to participate in the live poll. So go ahead and scan this and answer the question with a fill in a blank. The coffee spilled. Go get a. Okay, so let's take a look at some of those responses. Okay, we see napkin as the most common response given the word cloud here. We see towel, paper towel, tissue, rag, sponge, cloth or a napkin. Okay, so again, a word cloud here. Our word cloud is showing us the most frequently, by size, it's showing us the most frequently supplied responses. And in a way, this is what AI is also doing. So now those of you who listed mop or a towel, you were probably thinking of coffee like this or napkin, as we saw too. Now nobody said a broom, which could be possible if you were thinking about coffee like this. Which, by the way, as a side note, I once used this in a class and a student said, well, go get another cup of coffee, of course. But the point here is that there's a constrained and limited set of possibilities for the next word in the sentence. For example, we could say, go get a tree, but that would be, even though it's grammatically possible, it would be semantically nonsense. Okay, so based on your responses just now, let's just say that a highly probable response is napkin or towel. A less probable response is maybe broom, and an even less probable and indeed improbable response would be a tree. A large language model or an LLM predicts the next element in a string. So those predictions are based on the probability, and I'll add the statistical probability of a character appearing in the next string of letters in a word or a string of words in a sentence. So how do they predict this possibility or this probability? By being trained on large amounts of data. And in the training process, the LLM picks up on and learns from these patterns, predicting statistically the next possible or next probable rather in the string. Okay, so where did the data come from? Again, many of us know this already, but they come from a variety of sources, including publicly available text or licensed data through human feedback data. And it's controversial, of course, because of many of the ethical issues related to plagiarized or stolen data, bias in the data, and therefore also bias in the outputs, environmental issues related to computing power and energy needed for data centers. And then, of course, inequitable access across social groups, the exploitation of workers hired to do some of this human rating and filtering. Of course, in educational settings, we have concerns that this will shortcut or replace thinking, compromise learning. And I think many of us in foreign languages have grappled with this since the dawn of machine translation. So given the ethical concerns related to generative AI, the first question we ought to ask is whether we really need it. And we must, I think, all be ready and able to justify our own uses for ourselves, given what we know about the extraordinary environmental and human costs of AI. But on the other hand, as Harvard Business School professor Karim Lakhani famously said, AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace humans without AI. And I think whether that refers to ourselves as educators or our students, we have an opportunity to develop AI literacies and to guide our students in judicious uses of these tools. So we can, of course, choose to take it or leave it. That now brings us to part two, where we're going to look at how AI might support learners in second language reading and where we might draw the boundaries around its use. So let's start with some of the research. From the standpoint of learners, there's a growing number of studies that have looked at the impact of AI-generated texts on students' motivation, reading enjoyment, and comprehension. So Yilmaz and Iden, 2025, compared the motivation of two groups along 5 dimensions of motivation. And they had a control group read texts from the textbook, while the experimental group read text generated by ChatGPT, which were prompted carefully by the researchers to match the themes and levels in the textbook. The group that read AI-generated text demonstrated a slight increase in motivation, but only on one dimension of motivation, and that was what they called extrinsic text compliance. So there, another study, Lee, Shin, and No, 2023, examined the impact of AI-generated content on young learners' foreign language enjoyment. And they found a significant difference in foreign language enjoyment between the control group and experimental groups in their post-intervention survey. And one reason for their finding is that that they suggested was that the learners themselves were engaged in some of the generating of the passages, and they could customize the stories to their own interests. Murphy-Odo in 2025 investigated the comprehension of Korean first language and English second language learners with 3 experimental groups, an AI simplified versus a human simplified and an unmodified text group. And after controlling for other variables like topic interest, topic familiarity, perceived difficulty, he found that there was no significant difference in comprehension between the groups. So in other words, none of the text types seemed to offer an advantage for comprehension. And he surmised that current AI-generated simplifications are purely based on linguistic complexity, overlooking the value of including relevant information and cultural references that can also facilitate comprehension. So another area of research is in terms of reading environments and practices, and a wide variety of research has been conducted just in the past year, as we can expect, and looking at the effects of mediation on anxiety, academic reading achievement, and so forth. And I'll just highlight a couple of these here. Lin, and Tang, 2025, compared reading comprehension between students engaging in ChatGPT supported pre-reading and students engaging in teacher-led pre-reading exercises, and found a statistically significant advantages for readers in the AI supported group. Tongson and Anderson, 2025, found that across 5 weeks of reading and using ChatGPT as a dialogue partner, students went from using ChatGPT to support more surface level comprehension of text toward using it for more critical inquiry. Pan, Guo, and Lai, 2025, integrated a ChatGPT-powered custom platform called ReadMate into their classroom with Chinese L1 and English L2 learners. And what ReadMate allowed for was for students to set goals, customize the reading texts based on their interests, evaluate their own strategy use through clicking on a heart icon listed next to a strategy, asking for help, and so forth. So although the authors didn't report on students' reading outcomes per se, they reported that students generally had a positive impression of this reading environment. And that is a particularly interesting study demonstrating the kinds of interfaces in interactive environments that could help with self-efficacy and self-regulated reading. So while this line of research is still very nascent, it's, I think, a promising area in terms of providing differentiated reading support for learners. So let's look at then a few examples of AI as mediator in scaffolding pre-reading. So considering the source and making predictions about language structures based on genre, based on context of production or publication is one strategy we might use in pre-reading. And we might ask the AI to provide a brief overview. So our Misadventures in Paradise text came from the New York Times Magazine. Readers might or might not be familiar with that venue. So we might ask, what should I expect? So in this case, ChatGPT generated quite an extensive response in terms of the kind of writing, depth over immediacy, and so forth. So a response that would potentially require more unpacking and or more dialogue with students in a guided way. But we might ask then, okay, what would the language of anecdotes and vivid description look like? What kind of language forms should I expect? Now, some learners might know this intuitively, but sometimes an explicit step in that process may be helpful for reading. This kind of question might also be helpful for an instructor in preparing to teach a text, and then pulling out some examples of some of these features to also use as part of a pre-reading sequence. So one of the aspects of this text that makes it slightly more complex for second language learners is that there are quite a few cultural references. So for example, this quote that the trip started with a forum of hell called the International Terminal of Lax. Now we might infer that this is an airport if we know conventions for airport codes, but we might not know anything about Lax. So this could be a question for ChatGPT or Claude or whichever platform is being used. Why might lax be considered a form of hell? So here in this case, the ChatGPT gives us some of the discourses surrounding lax that maybe would become an important point in the misadventures conveyed in the travel narrative. So this, again, through this brief interaction, we get a little bit of background knowledge that could help us. Now, I say background knowledge with caution because these are discourses, these are stereotypes, and the output generated is, of course, generated based on the statistical probabilities of something appearing next in the string. So does AI output repeat discourses? Absolutely. But I think in this case, as a reading scaffold, with the caveat that this is also the part of larger discourse systems and could be perpetuating stereotypes is an important message for students. Let's look now at AI as a possible mediator in supporting vocabulary depth. So going back to these low frequency words that we saw in the text, plummet, etc., we were able to infer general meanings, and that maybe helped us move on and read fluently. But as a follow-on vocabulary building activity, we could guide students in using AI to develop a deeper understanding of these words, and sort of a broader and deeper understanding of their meanings. So in this chat, I've asked ChatGPT to list 3 examples of how plummet could be used in a sentence, specifically asking for only 3 because as we've seen, some AIs, and especially ChatGPT, tend to give quite lengthy responses. So now this could be an exercise done in class with the instructor modeling on a central computer with students watching and contributing. And then the instructor could guide students in collectively developing the next question for ChatGPT. So take a second now and consider what you might ask next. And you don't have to write this down, you can just think about this. So lots of different directions this could take, but maybe the next prompt could be to summarize this output and then kind of check in. Things that can plummet are prices, temperatures, and attendance. Can anything else plummet? And here we have another very rich set of responses that could be used, again, in various ways, categorization, activities, etc. Perhaps the next prompt is to differentiate plummet from the more general term fall. So in terms of supporting vocabulary depth, AI, I think, is a wonderful tool because it can help provide various contexts. Now, is it the only tool we have? No, but given its ubiquity and students' tendencies to use it, I think this is a potentially useful strategy to guide students in. Having students use AI as a mediator to support vocabulary depth rather than, let's say, as a knee-jerk reaction to look up a word straight away when reading a text comes back to this issue of the importance of lexical inferencing. So although there is some evidence in the literature for glossing and for lexical substitutions as one method of text adaptation, it may support reading fluency, but one trade-off is language development. Um, as Alex Gilmore quotes, Paul Nation, who is widely known for his work in vocabulary and development in reading, believes that incidental learning of lexis through guessing from context should be the most important method of vocabulary acquisition for learners. And this idea is picked up by Apkanar 2013, who states the reason why lexical inferences has been investigated widely by so many scholars mainly reflects the assumption that the greater the mental effort in processing a word, the more likely it is to be remembered. So when readers use AI or any machine translation tool for that matter to look up words, initially, before really trying to exercise their lexical inferencing skills, this may compromise learning. So just for fun, too, see how often we all use plummet in a sentence next week. All right, with that, let's pause here again and see if there are any other questions before we get to the third and final segment of this webinar.
Yeah, so we have actually several questions. The first one, and I think it ties a little bit to what you were just talking about, Kristen. Mishba is asking, could you please suggest some practical ways that students could learn and retain new words while reading? So tying this to the topic of today's generative AI, what would you suggest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think anything that will help sort of strengthen semantic connections. So categorizations, using words in context, and not just seeing them, right? I mean, if students are just reading an AI output or any kind of resource that's sort of telling them how these words are categorized, that's maybe a more passive interaction with vocabulary. But could that be used as a springboard for asking students to form those categorizations themselves? So that would be a different prompt than the one I mentioned, but maybe asking AI for synonyms of plummet, and then maybe trying to, let's say, arrange those on a continuum in terms of gradation, or and then checking those speculations, let's say, of the learner, checking back with the AI and engaging in a dialogue about whether those understandings are apt or not.
Great, thank you. The next question has to do with Gen AI modified text. So can generative AI modified text retain the authenticity of original materials, or does AI intervention fundamentally alter their status as authentic? Under what conditions, if any, is it pedagogically acceptable to treat Gen AI enhanced materials as authentic? And how should authenticity be defined in an era where Gen AI mediates access to real-world language and cultural content? I mean, there's three questions here. I can go
Yeah,
back. So if you want, the
that's
first
okay.
one was, does it retain the authenticity of original materials, or does it really fundamentally alter their status as being authentic?
Yeah, I love this question. How much time do you have? Uh, this is such a fundamental question, and we're going to talk in part three about authenticity, and as we look at kind of what teachers can do with AI to support reading pedagogies. And this is such a long-standing conversation and debate in the field of foreign language teaching, and I think the answer to this is partly, well, let me go one by one. So, can generative AI modified text retain the authenticity? I think I think that's a matter of ideology, and what you consider to be an authentic text. So, if you consider to be an authentic text one that was written by a human for any purpose that isn't foreign language teaching and that hasn't been altered, then I think the answer is no. AI modified texts automatically render them inauthentic. Um, Looking at the second part of the question, which I think is more about pedagogical acceptability, again, I think this is an ideological question. It depends on where you fall. So the question again is it pedagogically acceptable to treat generative AI enhanced materials as authentic? You're going to see very quickly, so I'll just tell you, you'll see very quickly my alignment on this. I don't think that AI enhanced materials are authentic. Is there a use for them? Maybe in some cases, maybe, but they're the purpose then becomes very different than a reading purpose, which I'm trying to work from, which is reading authentic texts within all of their sociocultural context of production. Um, I mean, I guess we could say reading a text out of an AI has its own sociocultural context of production, right? And we can engage learners in looking at an AI generated text and critiquing it, for example. That's the short answer. And
Uh-huh.
hopefully, some of what I say later will give you some more insights as well.
Okay. So somebody else had a question. Most of the examples you provide are through Chat GPT.
Mm.
Um, why? Yeah.
Yes. So I've dabbled with a lot of different kind of these what I consider to be more ubiquitous tools like ChatGPT, Claude, and then Magic School, for example. And then I've dabbled with some other platforms. Um, the Most of the examples I'm giving from ChatGPT, or at least the I think the reason that I'm using this to generate these use cases is because in my experience working in the North American context in the United States, that's a go-to tool. And so what I'm trying to do is see what these tools are doing, if that's going to be the tool that most learners and or teachers are going toward. In general, I tend to favor tools that allow for a dialogic interaction. So there are lots of tools like Twee, Question Well, that are sort of marketed to language teachers, and they've got a lot of convenient or seemingly convenient embedded tools, but they don't allow for a lot of dialogue and customization. You're really just putting in parameters like the language level, the learner level, the topic interest, and so there are a lot more constraints on what you can do with those other kinds of platforms.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take one more questions. I don't want to. You let me know if we need to move on or not. The next question was, and I think it's kind of related to what you were just talking about in your last few slides. What are the dangers of encouraging students to research the nuances between synonyms, for example, via AI, rather than using a reliable dictionary?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I think of AI as a tool, and I think of a dictionary as a tool. And I think the biggest danger I see is over reliance on AI. It's there, it's in our phones, in our pocket, at our fingertips, and it's what many learners might go to. But I'm not, I mean, I still stand by dictionary use in various ways. And I think the answer to this question is what tools are available. And, they're going to have different affordances, but any tool can be helpful.
Great. Do you want to move on, Kristen, or do you want
Yeah,
to
let's
take
move
a couple
on.
more questions? Just let me know.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's move on. And then if there are some more questions at the end,
Yeah,
we'll come back to these.
sounds good.
So. All right, so then that brings us to looking at the perspective of teachers, some of the affordances and constraints. And the first one that I think is becoming, for me, quite useful is for looking for text. So multiliteracies pedagogies are text-centered. And this is something that, although initially I was slow to adopt because my other strategies worked, I've come to see this as more useful over time. And I actually used it in preparing this presentation to help find a multimodal text related to a travel insurance company. That first prompt was not very useful. It wasn't very efficient, but the second prompt yielded exactly what I was looking for. This time I was a little more specific. I said play on the discourses of travel fiascos or something that exploits the message that something always goes wrong in travel. And although this was much more efficient, I found exactly what I was looking for. ChatGPT still spat out 358 extra words that I didn't need and offered me all manner of services. So, this is a lesson to me in writing an even more explicit prompt specifying what not to offer and not to go beyond what I'm asking in the question. So another potential affordance of AI is in analyzing a text's readability. When we teach with a text, the first thing we want to do is what I sometimes call hanging out with the text to determine its suitability for our students in terms of language, in terms of themes, and so forth. And while all of us are probably capable of doing this on our own, technology and the efficiencies afforded by technology could help us get started. So I've used, again, ChatGPT, given its relative ubiquity and affordances of multiple terms. And I asked for an overview of our, let's see, of our selfie stick text. So this is what it gave, an overall readability profile, more helpful even an evaluation of lexical complexity. So talking about vocabulary in terms of high frequency, concrete terms, then pointing out some lower frequency or abstract items. And again, if we did this work on our own as teachers, we could do this. But this, I think, is a potentially helpful efficiency in lesson preparation and planning. Grammatical complexity, just continuing the response. And by the way, I'm showing you snippets of the response, but the QR code that's here repeated across these slides is giving you access to the full chat transcript if you're interested in looking at that now or after the presentation as the slides will be available. So here we have an analysis of grammatical complexity. We've got sentence structure. We've got a discussion of tense and aspect. And then we have the CEFR assessment of B1. So not a bad starting point for evaluating readability. But then we have an evaluation of discourse and pragmatic features, and this ChatGPT says this is where the level rises. Notice, however, that because of the need to understand the emotional arc, ChatGPT suggests a higher proficiency level in order to engage in more complex inferencing. This is where I would disagree. I think readers at earlier stages of language development can surely engage in complex inferencing if well guided. So I would question this. I would say, why couldn't B1 readers engage in this kind of inferencing with some instructor guidance? And this sort of is reflective of a perception sometimes that learners with lower linguistic proficiency are also equated with learners with lower cognitive abilities. And I think that's a bias we see reflected in textbooks and other pedagogies, but is not necessarily fair to learners. So now let's talk about AI and generating reading questions. This is where I think we start to get to some of the perils. So taking our favorite text about the Venetian mishap, I asked Magic School AI here to generate a reading comprehension assessment. And this is what it produced. So I've analyzed these questions through a framework that I use quite often in thinking about reading tasks, which comes from Afflerbach, Cho, and Kim, their 2015 conceptual frame for assessing basic to complex thinking and reading. And this includes 7 levels of thinking. But if we look at these questions, they really only tap levels 1 and 2. So very surface level details, low in the cognitive complexity. So this is just one example, but this is generally reflective of my experiences with AI-generated reading questions, especially in apps like Magic School, or as I mentioned earlier, Twee and QuestionWell. And in fact, this generation of multiple choice questions seems to be a growing area in terms of research. And again, I'll just highlight a couple of studies here. Chun and Barley in 2024 compared human versus AI-generated listening practice test items for Korean as a second language. And what they did was prompt ChatGPT to generate some questions using the interlanguage roundtable skill level descriptors. And then they also asked human experts to rate these test items. Then they randomly combined the human and the AI-generated test items, and they asked the 3 independent raters to rate these items overall. What they found was that the ratings given to the AI-generated and human-generated items were comparable, but through more thorough qualitative analysis, they found some weaknesses in the AI-generated items, and specifically, they found that many of the distractors in the multiple choice questions were often easily perceived as less plausible. And then sometimes other questions served as clues to the response. Sometimes there was a linguistic or a structural contrast. For example, the key was negative and the distractors were positive. And then finally, and this is, I think, the most interesting finding from their study, they found that more than 50% of the time, the answers were identifiable using general or world knowledge rather than using the listening passage. While the correct answer might have been indeed derived from the passage, the AI would really have no sense of what constitutes world knowledge, and so would not know necessarily that this was answerable. And to quote from Kern in 2024 in his Modern Language Journal piece, GPT does not really know anything about language or the world. Rather, it predicts sequences of characters and then larger chunks of language based on their statistical likelihood of occurrence within the corpora on which it's been trained. And again, statistical likelihood of occurrence, I think, is a key idea. So just to highlight another study here, Rossi and Escobeiro in 2025 also tested the affordances of a custom GPT for generating MCQs. And they were essentially trying to see if they could get their custom GPT to produce questions targeting higher order cognitive processing. So they gave the GPT extensive documentation, including sample tasks and specifications, and then asked GPT to give metadata on the questions. And they also found, similar to Chun and Barley, a lot of flaws like double key, lexical overlap between the stem and the response, some misinterpretations of the text. So their overall conclusion was that their GPT's performance on the task was unpredictable. This, by the way, is a very nice study for anyone interested in pursuing this line of work, especially for its methodology. But from these studies, I think it seems like using AI to generate MCQs for reading yields unpredictable results that requires, at this point anyway, extensive human refinements. We'll see over time how that develops. So now let's talk about text generation. And this refers to the question that you asked earlier. We can look at this from a technical standpoint and an ideological one. I like this distinction from Boskert 2023 between organic and synthetic texts, or human generated and AI generated, or I like to say human created and AI generated. So I prompted ChatGPT to produce a text about a traveler in Venice, and this is what I asked. Please write a story about a traveler in Venice who tries to take a picture with a phone and a selfie stick, but the phone falls off and drops into the canal. The story should be poetic and contain 180 to 190 words, which is about as many words as that original text contained. Incidentally, I also prompted Claude AI and Magic School with the same prompt. Magic School generated a similar text and gendered the traveler as a she. Claude AI gendered the traveler as a he, so apropos biased outputs. So you can take a second to look at this here. Okay, so now we could debate the merits of this text. For example, how about this personification of Venice who did not apologize? But rather than that, let's talk about what is lost. So in the human created or the organic text, we have this poetic repetition of "it was not supposed to," and "it was not supposed to." This is a rhetorical design that conveys irony or frustration. We have the element of mystery. We were not told explicitly in the narrative that the fiasco involved a selfie stick. We had to infer this using background knowledge and other textual cues. And finally, behind the human written text about the selfie stick fiasco, we have, surprise, a human. So that text was written out of that human being's interest, out of their being in the world, and with a purpose to convey a personal experience in a humorous way. Every human text is full of agency. And I think when we outsource this process to AI from the ground up, we're diminishing human agency. Also drawing on some earlier work by Kern, when we read a text, we're in collaboration with the writer in a dialogic process of meaning making. And I think when we ask our students to engage with AI-generated texts, we're depriving them of that opportunity. And we're asking them really to just engage in what I call vapid vessels of vocabulary. I really like this perspective by Catherine Ahrens, who said that texts are not only sources of linguistic knowledge and cultural facts, but also representations of how culture is created and how it functions. They must be engaged not only for language and elements of content, but also as strategic interventions on the field of culture, as examples of how knowledge is produced, circulated, and managed. Reading as a multiliteracies practice demands that we not, I believe, subject our students to what Cope and Kalantzis in their 2024 piece have called, quote, boring robotexts. So I think asking AI to generate alternate or simplified versions of texts also subjects students to similarly boring robotexts. So again, I took our favorite Misadventures in Paradise text, and I asked Claude AI to assess the suitability of this text for and to indicate the optimal Cepher level. So they indicated that it was high B2 or even C1 based on low frequency vocabulary, many cultural references, and, quote, complex narrative voice shifting between literal description and comic exaggeration. Now, again, I personally think B1 readers can handle complex narrative shifts with the right amount of instructor guidance. So this is the first part of the text that it generated. And with this adaptation, we've now lost the personal voice, the humor, the rhetorical devices, the agentive design choices that were made by this text's author. And we also have, we have a simplification that might help language learners here in the first line. The tickets were non-refundable, which means I couldn't get my money back. But is that too much? So, I think what we have is we've lost the human agency, but we've also created what Janet Swaffer would call a culturally sanitized text. For such texts, she notes that graded or edited texts have, as their name indicates, been tailored expressly to limit students to vocabulary and morphological structures suitable for a designated learner norm. Their purpose is not in teaching particular content, but to teach language. Since they are designed for non-native learners, they are linguistically and in this sense culturally sanitized. And it is my belief that AI-generated texts operate in a similar way. Now, if we wanted some more authentic texts in the genre of a personal account of travel fiascos, we could just go back to our World Nomad website and read any one of these true stories from the claims department. And here you have a whole set of variations on genre, great for textual analysis, although um, um, some content more interesting and less interesting than others, right? So remember that we said earlier that reading as a multiliteracies practice involves a recognition that texts operate in specific sociocultural contexts. So here we can see how the genre travel recount is involving a fiasco is exploited for commercial purposes by the travel insurance industry, which is a point we might help students recognize by having them engage in comparative interpretation of two different travel accounts. For example, maybe our selfie stick fiasco text and then one of these World Nomad accounts. Okay, but what if you have no idea where to start? Maybe multiliteracies pedagogies are new, you haven't had the opportunity to learn these approaches or the underlying theories thereof. This is, again, where I think ChatGPT, Claude, other AIs can be helpful in generating lesson sequences, but not without some caveats. So here was my initial prompt. I had an overarching goal, two texts, some steps. I wanted to see the readability, and then I wanted a pedagogical sequence with the best practices in foreign language education. Now, this is incredibly reductive, I know, but I was testing ChatGPT to see what, quote, best practices it would generate. And so after the first prompt, it offered a worksheet. I took it up on that. And here are some of the elements of this output. So here we have a pre-reading activity involving students' personal life experiences, a vocabulary building activity. We have first reading, getting the gist. Then we have second reading, getting the details. Then we move on to text number 2, which is not on these slides, but again, the QR code will give you access to the entire chat transcript. So we've got some multiple choice questions about the main idea, some inferencing questions about how the writer feels, and so forth. All of these are fine learner tasks, but I would argue that they simply reflect the status quo in foreign language education by engaging learners in surface level facts and details, and as such, do not really sort of help work towards goals of multiliteracies reading. It offered me several more options. I refused and I said, no, instead, please modify this lesson sequence to include the following principles. And these are the principles I showed you earlier in this presentation. So I named it and gave it some specific principles. And here, this actually quite surprised me. My experience here aligned with what Cope and Kalantzis said in one of their pieces in 2023. This is a lesson for learners and teachers. Don't ask it to do more than it can, it being AI. Give it facts, but don't ask for them. Give it disciplinary concepts rigorously defined elsewhere if you were going to ask it to work with them. Supply context when needed. And, I don't think the input I gave was all that rigorous, but it was principled. And this is something that in the future I will continue to add to. So what I've seen over and over again in prompting AI to produce materials and especially lesson sequences, is a reflection of the status quo in foreign language education. And this makes sense because these AIs are simply reproducing the data that they've been trained on. So for me, AI poses a lot of problems for innovation in foreign language teaching, especially if we're asking AI to do materials design work for us, unless we carefully prompt it. Okay, again, you have the QR code for this chat if you want to follow along. So these are just some of the excerpts and that ChatGPT produced in this case. So I'm going to go through a little bit more quickly here, since you can look at this again on your own. But I just want to highlight here too that we have these explicit prompts that could become scripts for teachers as they lead students in a multiliteracies oriented reading or language lesson. So we have making predictions about genre, the idea that meaning is shaped by genre and platform, or I would say context of production. Then we have, but later in the sequence, we have a think aloud where a model script is suggested, where the teacher would model some different ways to think about the text. And then a student reading with guided attention phase with a reminder that students are not looking for the right answer, but evidence of design choices. So again, I was pleasantly surprised with this sequence. I found it to be a good starting point for generating a multiliteracies oriented lesson through a lot of the key principles that it includes. It's a decent start. But there are quite a few glaring omissions, and this is where customizing the input or possibly even creating a custom GPT would be an important next phase. And that is that we in the sequence, other modes of communication are not really addressed beyond the linguistic mode. Um, there are also very few questions about genre, although the sequence does incorporate questions about context of production, especially of the travel recount from the World Nomad site. So this is a good start, I think. But another caveat is the texts that I'm using are monolingual texts, and that's just for the purpose of this presentation. But another important aspect of multiliteracies is engaging learners' multilingual identities and multilingual dimensions in texts. So, I have not yet put that to the test, but AI is generally not great with multilingualism. So anyway, you can continue to peruse the other aspects of the sequence. But I think the lesson here is that, a one-shot prompt or an initial prompt is going to regress to the status quo. So if we want innovation in language teaching, we have to be very explicit in inputting disciplinary content and principles into the machines that we're using. So moving toward our conclusion, going back to the research, I think even though there's support for AI generated or synthetic texts and their positive impact, I tend to disagree with this for all the reasons given earlier. But I suspect that this line of research will quickly align with debates about whether L2 learners should be exposed to authentic, unedited texts or modified texts. And I think this is not a technical question as much as it is an ideological one. In terms of reading assessments, output might be a good starting point, but as we saw from some of the research, needing a lot of human interpretation and modification afterwards. And then in terms of reading environments and practices, I think this is a really promising area in terms of providing individualized support for students. So then, just to conclude somewhat, I think the promises are using AI as, in terms of reading, as schema activator, scaffold for background knowledge, vocabulary depth work. For teachers, I think in finding texts, analyzing readability as a starting point for lesson sequences, of course, with the caveat of including very particular principles in the prompts. And then the perils that I see are AI supplanting important reading skills and literacies, modifying and generating texts, and really displacing human agency. And then, of course, perpetuating ideologies about language teaching and learners. But I think there's quite a lot of promise with provided that we are giving the tool our specific principles and frameworks and using those same principles in evaluating the output and collaborating with the tool and with our own minds to refine and enhance the output. So with that, we'll conclude. And I think we have maybe a minute for questions or two.
Yes, we do. Um, well, thank you again, Kristen, for this really great presentation, very insightful. And as you can see from the comments in the chat, people are really excited about this presentation and how it's insightful it was. Um, the first question, and I'm going to go, there's about 14. I don't think we'll be able to go or answer all of them, but let's take the first one and then I'll peruse as you answer. Do you think AI can replace purposefully designed curricula for teaching reading in foreign languages, particularly curricula that focus on reading skills?
I don't. I mean, I think, I mean, I don't know, we're still in early stages, so we'll see how it develops. The technology is getting better, and I think humans are learning better prompting techniques, but I just don't see it fully replacing human work in this process. I mean, there's so much that goes into it. We need to know so much about, I mean, there's a lesson plan, and then there's the way we enact it. There's the way we create it to align with our learner preferences and needs. So, yeah, in short, I don't see a complete replacement.
Thank you. Um, Alba is asking, considering that in second language education there is such a big component of cultural teaching, how can we as teachers ensure that students are aware of AI biases? And moreover, how can we fight it?
Yeah, great question. I'll point to a resource that I think is super helpful through the Berkeley Language Center. Kimberly Vanal and Emily Helmick have been working on AI resources. And I'll put this as part of the resources. You'll see, I'll actually go to this now. Um, I've got a Google Drive for you of the references for this presentation and then some other resources. And there's a document there that lists the Berkeley Language Center. Excellent, excellent, ready-made. Use this with your students to walk through prompting and dialoguing and looking at the biases that are inherent in AI.
Another question, how effective is generative AI for teaching less commonly taught languages or multilingual classrooms?
Yeah, not as effective as monolingual. And I think this is a major shortcoming in terms of less commonly taught languages or world languages in general. AI it's only going to output what its outputs are dependent on the data that it's been trained on. So there's a preponderance of English text material upon which many AIs have been trained. So it's going to perform less well in languages that in which it has not been trained on as much data.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have reached the end of this webinar. So we're sorry we could not get to all the questions that were in the Q&A, but I hope as you go and maybe listen again to the webinar when it becomes available, and also look at the resources that have been posted in relation to it, you'll be able to find answers to those questions that we are leaving unanswered at this point.
And please feel free to email me as well if you want more resources. I'm consider myself a learner in this, but I'm constantly finding new things and happy to share what I've learned.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. All right, so this is the end. Kristen, thank you so much. It was great. Learned so much. It's also, since I was teaching a tech course last semester, and we did a lot of poking around and using tools, so that was really kind of, I wish that happened last semester so we could have had this, but this was
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
thank you for the invitation. I'm glad that it worked out, and hopefully there was something for everybody.